If Ukraine loses, then welcome to the world of empires, welcome to the world of big powers, welcome to the world of new colonization of resources.
When Russia reinvaded Ukraine in 2022, it seemed like a war from the past, the first large-scale land battles in Europe since the Second World War. Soldiers in trenches, tanks in the countryside, civilians huddled in underground bunkers, and the return of NATO. 3 years later, Ukraine feels like a conflict of the future, a battlefield dominated by swarms of drones, big data, AI, and the dawn of a post-NATO era. In the past week alone, we've witnessed a historic shift in global geopolitics as the new Trump administration has abandoned Ukraine and its NATO allies in favor of seeking a quick deal with Russia. The deal, if news reports are to be believed, may go beyond just Ukraine and involve the return of American business to Russian markets for the first time since the conflict began. But what do the Ukrainians at the heart of this conflict feel about being used as a chip in a larger grand bargain? In today's episode of In Solidarity, we speak to Volodymyr Yermolenko, a Ukrainian philosopher, academic, and editor of Ukraine World. Volodymyr lives in Kyiv and is also the host of the popular Explaining Ukraine podcast. Welcome to the show, Volodymyr.
Aman, it's a real pleasure to meet you again, and I was really enjoying our conversations both online and in the real world that we had previously.
Volodymyr, you've been in Ukraine for the last 3 years, barring occasional visits. So, over 3 years of conflict, you've gone from there was a world that was normal, there was this rupture, and now there's this new, strange normal. Can you talk to us about what these last 3 years have been like for you?
Yeah, everybody talks about 3 years, but we Ukrainians know that it started in 2014. And many of our friends, many of our colleagues were already on the front line at that time. And many of our friends were already refugees or internally displaced persons. Many of them have lost their homes already back then in 2014, 2015 in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. We can count even farther. We can talk about 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia. And we have been with you in Georgia, and we understand. I hope you got a feeling how much we have in common, the Georgians and Ukrainians, because we share this experience of always challenging this big empire. The Georgians and Ukrainians were together always challenging this big empire, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire, but at the same time suffering from it very, very much. I mean, we can go farther and farther and farther in history. And basically, of course, the Second World War, which was basically mostly on Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Polish territory. All these tragedies kind of maybe prepared us for the feeling that if you have normality, if you have some kind of a paradise in your life, it's probably an exception. And I think this explains why Ukrainians, nobody is prepared for the war, but why, despite this unpreparedness, Ukrainians succeeded to mobilize so quickly.
One of the things you talk about is how the nature of, like, you quite often have been visiting the front lines. You're a philosopher, you're a musician, you teach philosophy, you do podcasts, but you also have been visiting the front lines very regularly, carrying supplies for troops. What has been your impression of the front line, and has it changed through the course of this most recent conflict? Has it felt kind of like a frozen conflict? Looking at it from the outside, it becomes tempting for those of us living in safety to be like, okay, so the conflict is now frozen in place, the front line isn't moving.
That's a very good question, Aman. And basically, we wrote the whole book about it, which will be published in Ukrainian in a few months with my wife, Tetiana Harkova, which is called Life at the Edge. So it will be published in Ukrainian. I hope we'll get translations into other languages. But the major essay of this book starts with basically how we travel and how certain things disappear and how certain other things appear. For example, kids disappear at a certain moment. Well, you see some children, but in a much lesser extent. Young people disappear. then traffic lights disappear, for example. Civilian cars disappear. Instead, you have much more military cars, and much more people in military uniform who are actually the same civilians as you are. Most of the Ukrainian soldiers are former civilians, the university teachers, the truck drivers, the IT specialists, the managers, etc. And I think this is kind of a metaphor that on the one hand, you see that life disappears. On the other hand, you see that life intensifies. So you have relations between people which are totally different than relations during the peacetime. You have brotherhood and sisterhood, which are unthinkable in a peaceful time when everybody is atomized and everybody has his or her own, tiny cozy space. So you see the new type of connections and you see the new attitude to life. You understand that life is fragile. Basically, abstractly, you always understand that life is fragile. But when you're on the front line, I think you understand. And I haven't gone through this experience in that much, but I've read a lot what soldiers have written, and this is a one very big and important part of the Ukrainian culture right now. The texts written in the trenches, or the texts written by the soldiers, and then of course you see this understanding of the fragility of life when you have a person who is breathing, who is joking, and then in the next second, mm, he's or she is dead.
I want to stay with this idea for a second because you talk about the sort of viscerality of life, but perhaps one of the enduring legacies of the Ukraine conflict, which is going to reverberate around the world for I think many years, is that Ukraine also appears to be the front line of the conflicts of the future, where we've seen a move to a highly sort of automated form of violence. And you've spoken elsewhere about this what drone warfare really looks like in the front lines now, where if Afghanistan heralded the idea of the kind of predator drone high in the sky occasionally, firing a missile, the Ukraine front lines, at least from what I've been reading, seem to be characterized by this buzzing swarm of small off the counter drones that have been kind of reverse engineered. And listening to you in various podcasts talk about this, I I found myself thinking about the the nature of war itself, where if you have automated machines on both sides fighting each other, then how does one actually think about this conflict? Is it whose machines can kill more men on both sides?
Look, again, very interesting question, and I think the nature of the warfare changed a lot during the modern times when people were not killing each other with swords anymore, and you have just a gun, a musket, or something like that, and you just shoot, or you have and you don't see the faces of people who you shoot. You don't touch their skin. You don't see their blood. So it's already dehumanizes people and dehumanizes violence. If I can say in this way, I think it sounds horrible, but I mean, we all know that in ancient culture you have certain very special attitude towards violence. Yes, violence is bad, but at the same time, it can be sacralized in a way, and every violence, every necessary violence, even killing of animals, were so much ritualized. Of course, in the modern society, we entered a period of certain industrialization of violence, and this is a basic story, basic reflection of philosophers. So, modern era, does it bring good? Does it bring less violence, or it brings more latent violence? And I think it's eternal discussion. But still, if you are killed by a bullet or by a shell, that means that somebody human is on the other side. Now we are increasingly going into a situation when on the other side there can be a machine, and machine that identifies a target itself. So it must not necessarily that there is a person behind it, and very soon we can enter a situation when not only identifies the target but actually shoots. Right now, it's still humanized, and I always kind of say that if you remember one of the episodes of the Black Mirror TV series when you have these bees killers, we are quite close to that because drones get smaller and smaller and smaller, and probably at some point we will really have the killer bees that will just enter our apartments and will be able to kill a person. So yeah, I think there is lots of things to be worried about. How technologically we are evolving as humans, but at the same time, it's a question what to do. And the problem is that if you stop in technological development, you will be very easily exterminated. Therefore, I'm always saying that the good when you have the evil and the good, and for me we can discuss it. I have a very specific definition of what evil is, but if the good is naive, it's actually become an instrument of the evil. It helps the evil. So you need to understand how evil works, how the destruction works in order to stop it in some way.
You had spoken about how the war in Ukraine is not a war of territory, but a war of values. Why do you say that? And what do you mean when you say that?
Well, because I think the mystery of the human nature is how to combine individuality with community. So if we go to the extremes, if we are too much individualistic and too much atomized, so we cannot build communities, we cannot no longer communicate. And I think the Western civilization goes into this direction, and this very dangerous. This is very dangerous. I'm not saying it's totally fatal, but I think that there is a big problem in the way how people overestimate their individuality and overestimate, their self-expression needs and all this stuff. On the other hand of the coin, we see collectivism. We see collectivism from Russia. We see collectivism from China, where basically individuals do not exist. So individuals are just cells in a big body, and they can be sacrificed very easily. And Russia shows when I'm saying Russia, just for your listeners to understand, I'm not essentializing it. I'm not saying that all Russians are like that or whatever. I'm saying about a particular Russian political project, which for me dates from the 16th century, the late 15th, early 16th century. So it's quite a long project. It has a big history, and it shows its capacity to regenerate itself, to reinvent ideas on which it is based upon. So it can be based on religious ideas like in the 19th century, or on atheist ideas like in the 20th century. But the core of this political project is to say that the humans are small, individuals don't matter, you can sacrifice them, human lives don't matter, doesn't matter. But the big thing, the big collective matters. And therefore, the big collective thing acts through violence, through coercion, and it gets respect from its uh, parts, from its individuals, when it is capable of extreme violence. And this is a paradox, that the violence in this Russian political project is not a negative, something that you need to escape, but rather a key, a core on which you basically build your political body. I don't think that it is eternal. I have no forecast for the future. I think it's quite possible that at some point this Russian political organism will change, but for it will need to have lots of intellectual and social work. But at this moment, it's like this. And I think that the reality, the good society is a society that can combine these two. That it's saying, okay, individuals, of course, you have a right to exist. Of course, individual life matters, but you kind of in the goal of your life is to do something bigger than yourself, to realize some big values, to connect with other people. And despite the fact that I see the problems in the Western civilization with this, of course, for me, it's clear that the biggest danger for this equilibrium, how to combine individual and community, is this hyper collectivist project that Russia presents.
Hi, my name is Sian Norris, and I'm a senior investigative reporter at openDemocracy. My work investigating military sexual abuse, telling the stories of those at the sharp end of government anti-migrant policies, exploring prison data, and reporting on the dark money powering anti-abortion interests is only made possible thanks to your support. Please donate to support Open Democracy today. Simply visit opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you.
And we're back. Let's now turn our lens to the West, because we're recording this on the eve of what seemed to be a series of very rapid changes with Donald Trump coming to power. And as we're talking, the situation is changing very rapidly. But there are a few things that the Americans have said which are a cause of great concern to Ukrainians. One, of course, being that joining NATO is most likely not an option. The other being that some degree of territory will have to be sacrificed by the Ukrainians. One of the frankly quite terrifying phrases that I heard on one of your podcasts was a diplomat talking about the West German model, which seemed to suggest almost a bifurcation of a people. Have you been surprised, or is there a sense of betrayal with the propositions that the Trump administration is bringing to the table, with the nature with which this negotiation is going ahead? Because for 3 years, there was a sense that the West is giving Ukraine just enough weapons to not lose the war. And after 3 years of this, it seems the West is now saying, let's freeze this conflict here, and we've run out of stomach for a fight.
No matter where they're from on the whole planet. And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine.
Yeah, but look, in these discussions, we underestimate the key player, which is Ukraine. And if we look at the recent history, and that was my point in my very recent episode for Ukraine World, is that, the decades since the Ukrainian independence are the decades where Ukraine has shown a remarkable agency. And this agency and subjectivity was not only contrary to the will of Russia, but it was also contrary to the will of the United States or contrary to the will of Europe. Because we all remember American President George Bush, the senior, coming to Kyiv and saying before the collapse of the Soviet Union that Ukraine should stay in the Soviet Union, and a few months after Ukrainians declared the independence. We all remember how European Union was really keen at holding us behind the doors and saying, okay, maybe we will give you free trade area, but we will not give you the membership perspective. So now we have a candidate status. We open the talks about membership. We don't know how they will end, but at least it's totally changing the mental map of Europeans who, that was my point, that the collapse of the Soviet Union, nobody took it seriously in the West, and people were saying, okay, but Soviet Union should continue to exist, but in a different form. So let's not underestimate the agency of Ukrainians. Let's not underestimate the fact that major weapons that Ukrainians are fighting with now are actually Ukrainian, and that Ukrainians are striking deep into the Russian territory with our own drones. So it's where Europe can step in and help financially and help Ukrainians produce much more weapons. And look at the map. I go very, very, very often to the front line. I talk to soldiers. Of course, the Western support was very important, but I'm not sure it was decisive in terms of weapons. I see that the guns that Ukrainian fighters have are mostly the old Soviet guns. I see that cars which they're driving are mostly the old cars, pickups and jeeps that we volunteers are bringing to them. I see that lots of equipment that they have actually been supplied by the Ukrainian society, by Ukrainian business, by Ukrainian state, etc. So we will see what will happen. I don't see any real plan in Trump administration, because territories, I mean, there are huge questions. What kind of territories? Which territories? Because Russia wants much more territories than it actually controls. So I think that Trump administration doesn't realize the complexity of the problem. And of course, I think, well, we also want peace, frankly speaking. Of course, we are tired to live under bombs every night. Every midnight starts with air raids, and we go to sleep when there are air raids, and we bring children to school despite the air raids, and people die every day. Of course, everybody is tired, but we need to protect our sovereignty. Ukraine should not become a new Russian province. Ukraine should not become a new Belarus. Ukraine should not become, a new Russian colony. That's what we are fighting for. And Trump needs to understand two things: that if Ukrainians do not accept this deal, they will continue to fight, and the war will be prolonged, and there will be no peace. Because, I mean, it's normal that you protect your own territory. And the second thing, if there are no security guarantees for Ukraine, Russia will continue to fight, because Russia wants much more than just a tiny territories in the eastern Ukraine. Russia wants to raise its flag over Berlin. Russia wants Poland back. Russia wants Baltic states back. It was so clear from its propaganda and from its statements. Therefore, if we don't achieve sustainable peace, which means security guarantees, which means probably certain peacekeepers, which means a lot of things only on the part of the West. I mean, everybody talks about concessions from Ukraine, but where are concessions from Russia, and where are concessions from the West? Let me ask, and where are concessions from other people? So right now, all this for me shows a great naivety of Trump administration, and sooner or later they will need to understand where the problem is.
One of the books I was reading, I ended up reading two books to kind of prepare myself for this interview. And one was The Fall of the Ottomans by Eugene Rogan. And the other was The Gates of Europe by Serhiy Plokhy. Am I saying that right? And what I found really, really interesting and a common thread in both of these books was how quickly empires that seem to have lasted forever suddenly crumble. So with the Ottoman Empire, you see a 600-year-old empire kind of disintegrate in what, a decade. And in the history of Ukraine, which is the gates of Europe, there is a incredible velocity with which empires rise, empires fall, alliances are made, alliances are broken, and a series of really unusual alliances that keep coming up in and around Ukraine. And that made me think about what the next decade would potentially look like. And it made me almost think that the Ukraine conflict is perhaps one of the first conflicts of the future, in the way that 9/11 set the tone for the last 20, 25 years. It almost strikes me as if the Ukraine conflict will be the kind of defining moment of the next decade or longer.
Yes, well, it depends how it will end, and it depends on what will be happening this year and the next years. So in Europe, the early 21st century was fantastic, because you had the biggest enlargement of the European Union in 2004, and then you have huge growth and everything was fine. In Ukraine, it was a very interesting decade where Ukrainians started really challenging the Russian power. So because the 90s were still when we were a vassal state of Russia, more or less. It was the early 2000s when we started to challenging the Russian power, and finally it brought to the Orange Revolution. And it was a big blow for the Russians because Putin initially, not very many people noticed that, but even initially he had this in mind that he needs to restore the Russian Empire. He had this in mind even in early 90s, because there are some interviews on the internet that you can watch to understand this. So these worlds have clashed actually, and what kind of worlds? The worlds of re-imperialization and the worlds of de-imperialization. That are the trends. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Georgia are really turning points, because from these wars, it will be decided where the 21st century will bring more empires or less empires. Because it was kind of illusion probably after this decolonization process that it's a new normality. It's the way how the world is going on. While the law of history is different. The law of history is that, well, not the law, but some kind of repetitive pattern, is that when an empire collapses, there are other empires who jump in. It's very rare that when empires collapses, you have beautiful democracies and beautiful republics instead. Again, let me repeat: if Ukraine wins, or at least if it does not lose dramatically, and if it joins the European Union, if it joins this system, which I call the Republic of the Republics, which is very, very bad and bureaucratic, but probably the best thing ever invented in the world. And I'm very sad to see how Europeans go with the suicide in it. The Republic of the Republics, kind of a federation of democracies, is the compromise between the idea of the empire and the idea of nation state, because it's stronger than the nation state, but it's not tyrannical as empires are. So if Ukraine wins and joins this process and brings Moldova with itself, and occasionally Georgia, and maybe occasionally Belarus, then we will be in the world where the decolonization will continue, and we will have chances for other peoples in the world, for other nations in the world, even to resist the new imperialism of China, which is kind of a very hybrid form of imperialism, which is both capitalist and communist. If Ukraine loses, then welcome to the world of empires, welcome to the world of big powers, welcome to the world of new colonization of resources, and 19th century will appear very, very, how to say it, light compared to what we will experience, because we will be controlled by the machines, and the machines will be much more cruel towards us. I would really love to avoid this world, yeah, and therefore I do think that yes, Ukrainian fight has a global meaning in this sense.
I'm not going to let us end on this kind of dark fork. You have a new podcast coming up which you call Thinking in Dark Times. For our listeners, what is the first step towards thinking in dark times?
The first step is to be realistic, sober, pessimistic. The first thing is to understand that the normality is actually darkness and not light. We should find the light inside this darkness. And then you suddenly understand that probably only in the darkness you can see the light. So I do think that being in the darkness is tragic, is more difficult, but at the same time it makes you more lucid. It makes you understand the world much better, and it makes you cherish the light much better and much more, and cherish such good things as love and life and empathy and the birth of new people and all this stuff. So I do think that, you know, when you jump into this darkness and maybe pessimism, is for the first moment when you really understand what it meant to be an optimist. I hope in a situation when there is no hope. I think this is what is important, not only about our situation right now in Ukraine, but about humans in general.
Volodymyr, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Thank you for listening to our show. If you'd like to support us, visit opendemocracy.net/donate. That's opendemocracy.net/donate. In Solidarity is produced by James Battershill, Ayodeji Rotinwa, and Nandini Archer. Audio clips are from CSPAN. The theme song is Odyssey by Edward Abela.